On the morning of February 9th, 1855, the residents in South Devon, England discovered something very eerie when they went outside. After a heavy snowfall the night before, they found snow prints that they've never seen before. Unfortunately, around this time period, cameras were still not available for the masses, so there is no actual photo. But there were several newspapers which covered this story. And this hand-drawn image was illustrated, and it is the snow prints that the residents witnessed. During the discovery, a number of people gathered around and examined it, but they were stunned that this specific track didn't match any known creatures in the area. They alerted the authorities to look further into it and made a thorough investigation. According to their reports, it was measured about 4 inches long and 3 inches wide. The space between each footprint is about 8 to 10 inches apart. The track was described to be in single file, which means that unlike deer snow prints, for instance, I'll use this picture for example, where you can clearly see a vertical separation between each one, the single file track only has horizontal separation. As a result, we can conclude that it is very unlikely that a big animal with 4 legs was responsible for this. Also, speaking of the tracks, they covered about 60 to 80 miles. But what makes this so odd is that all week there was heavy snowfall, so it was strange that these prints were found to be quite fresh. While the reasonable answer to this is that it probably came from an animal roaming in the morning, the locals were not convinced by this, since the snow prints closely resemble a cloven hoof marking, which sometimes is used as a symbol of the devil. Apart from the tracks they found on the field, they also discovered them on rooftops and over walls, so this raised a lot of curiosity. This wasn't just a one-time occurrence. For the next couple of days, they witnessed fresh tracks and it shared the same pattern and markings. All in all, it showed up to 30 different locations in the South and East Devon area. The story of this mysterious case took the community by storm. Various newspapers got their take on how exactly the snow prints popped up. Several witnesses had a slightly different description of the markings. As you can see here, each track was not entirely identical. For instance, that one in the middle, the prints looked like it was cut in half, but we can conclude that all of them are creating a U shape. This mysterious incident made the locals start arming themselves more for added protection. They were sure this was no ordinary creature. They didn't believe it came from an animal. But even though they were in a defensive position and were always alert, they also wanted to find the main root of this mystery. So a group of hunters decided to follow one of the trails in hopes of finding a real answer. However, as they continued their journey and tracked the snow prints, they came across a dead end. The trail suddenly disappeared in the middle of the field. It wasn't like it entered a bushy area and the trail separated. The whole thing was strange, as if the creature who was responsible for this just flew away. So, what are the possible explanations for this? Well, the first one, they believed that it came from a kangaroo. A privately owned zoo nearby reported that a kangaroo escaped days before the snow prints showed up. You might be wondering, the footprint of a kangaroo is nowhere near resembling a cloven hoof. Well, it was suggested that the print itself may have been partially covered in snow, which then formed the likeness of a cloven hoof. But there is a problem in this. First of all, that chances for this to happen are quite low. I mean, if you examine it closely, it seems impossible that a kangaroo snow print could be transformed into cloven hoof markings. Also, another reason is that kangaroos hop on 2 legs. The original tracks were clearly single file, which ultimately dismissed this theory. Another possible explanation was that it may be caused by weather balloons. They were released for experimental purposes. These weather balloons had a shackle attached on the end of its rope, so it was believed that these may have dragged in the snow and made the markings. The shackle here, for example, clearly resembles a cloven hoof when pressed against the snow. However, here is where the big problem lies. Some areas of the markings were surrounded by trees, so if it's true that these weather balloons flew above it, then the shackles most likely got tangled up with the trees, which would then leave a lot of evidence. But this was not the case. No evidence of tangled rope was found, and not even the weather balloon was discovered in the area. The third theory was that it was made by a hopping rodent. A specific mouse called the wood mouse was known to inhabit the area. This could explain why there were markings on the rooftops and over the walls, since these little creatures could reach these places. The hopping movement they do to travel on the snow leaves an imprint similar to a cloven hoof. But the loophole of this explanation is that it sounds impossible that a single rodent could hop and cover almost 60 to 80 miles non-stop in the snow. Even if you say there were multiple rodents who covered these tracks, it wouldn't make a single file track. It would be all jumbled up, and each track would take a different path. So while this could be the closest possibility to explain this mystery, there are still some holes that need to be answered. Despite these theories that were proposed, some people believed that these tracks were a complete hoax, and the locals fabricated it just to cause hysteria among the community. Back then, way before the internet or television, one form of entertainment that they did was storytelling, so it was theorized that a few locals did this stunt to scare the rest of the residents, and to get enough attention so it can be headlines in the newspapers. But there are some questions regarding this. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, the locals indeed planted these tracks. What approach did they use to create such markings? I mean, there would be human boot prints right besides the tracks to show someone had deliberately painted cloven hoof markings. Even if you say that someone handcrafted a boot and modified the sole to have a cloven hoof design, they wore it on the snow, so they can't leave any other footprints behind. It sounds unreasonable, since that person also had to return to their place, which would then show the tracks pointing at their house, and ultimately identify them as a suspect. If you're thinking that the person may have changed footwear on the way back, or at least wore something different, well, that's not possible, because apart from the cloven hoof tracks, there were no other footprints. Throughout history, a lot of researchers were fascinated with these snow prints. One of them agreed and believed that the hopping rodent was the closest explanation, but he believed that it didn't come from a single source. He proposed that several other animals who also were able to imprint a U-shaped marking could be responsible for this. Let's look back at the hand-drawn image from several witnesses. As you can see here, even though each print has the likeness of a cloven hoof, they don't look exactly the same as each other. So it is a strong possibility that each track was made by different animals. One may be by a wood mouse, and others may be by a rabbit or a badger. This wasn't the only case of alleged devil's footprints that were discovered. A similar case was in 2009, and this also happened in Devon, England, but the one in 1855 was found in the south and east of Devon. This time, it was found in the northern area. Unlike the original mystery, this one has a photo. If you look closely at it, you can see an upside-down U shape, which is quite similar to the drawing from 1855. Jill Wade, an elderly resident, was the one who alerted the authorities when she first found it. The tracks were scattered around her garden, and there were no other markings. Since this opened up the 150-year-old mystery, a zoologist did an extensive investigation. The track almost resembled the one in 1855. It was single file. The width and length of each print were almost identical. The one who was responsible for this was possibly the same one as the one from the original. Good thing though, with modern photo analysis, it pinpoints that these markings were likely made by rabbits or hares. If only this technology was available back in 1855, they could have solved that case and have a clear answer to it. But since they merely had to rely on hand-drawn images to figure out the mysterious snow prints, it still remained unanswered and is now dubbed the Great Devon Mystery of 1855.